Hi guys, thank you so much for stopping by once again. This is Batok with Ola. My name is Mujula Olua. Today we want to talk about how to write your chapter 4. That's the concluding chapter of your LLM thesis. And I'm going to talk about how I wrote my own and what I wrote, and the process. And then we're going to tie up this series. If you're just joining the channel or if you're just seeing the video on writing my LLM thesis, I started a series, to talk about my LLM journey, the thesis writing part of it, So I've talked about the whole process. Then I started talking about writing chapters, chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3, and this is chapter 4. My school used a 4-chapter, method, and that's why it's chapter 4. So it could be your own chapter 5. Please look through the channel and probably check the playlist section to see the particular playlist on writing an LLM dissertation so that you can get it. I know that, generally there's a differentiation between thesis and dissertation. But for this video and this particular series, I have used them interchangeably to mean the same thing. Not that they mean the same thing necessarily, but I have used them in my own particular case here to mean the same thing. My, school called it dissertation, but I'm used to saying thesis. So let's just go with that. So chapter 4 is the concluding part, and I remember that I wrote chapter 4 in a day, if that's correct. I wrote it in a day, thereabouts, and I wrote it about 2 days to the deadline. The deadline for submission was on the 25th of that month, I remember, and I know that I submitted my chapter 4 on the 23rd of that month. It was important for me to submit ahead of time because my supervisor was looking through, and passing comments and, improvements that needed to be done. And I was really happy with what he had done so far. So I wanted him to look at the chapter 4 before I, tied up everything and submitted. So I was submitting chapter by chapter. So when I submitted chapter 4, I was hoping and waiting against hope for him to send me his, to give his feedback, If he hadn't, it would be right because, it was quite late. It was just about a 24 to 48 hour difference, between the time that I submitted and the deadline. And God so good, he actually gave his feedback. I remember clearly that for chapter 4 in particular, he said that I could have used more subheadings. I know he said that, and I said some great things about it too. But let's look at my chapter 4. I have it here, so I'm looking at my computer. Chapter 4, I had the one that I submitted first. I had conclusion, that's 4.0. Then I had recommendations, conclusion, then policy implications. So 4.0, 4.1, 4.2. So that's what I had. And then by the time that he looked at it and he gave his comments and feedback, I had increased my chapter. It was about the same number of words. It was less than 2,000 words. My chapter 4 was less than 2,000 words. The one I initially submitted was 1,593 words, and the one that I finally turned in after implementing corrections was 1,730 words, because some things were deleted, some things were added. But for the final chapter 4, here are the headings that I now added. But for the final chapter 4, here are the headings that I eventually used, conclusions and conclusion and recommend. But for the final chapter 4, here are the headings that I eventually used, conclusion and recommendations. 4.1 conclusion, 4.11 regional consent supersedes sovereign consent. Then 4.1.2, a lost or compromised sovereignty legitimizes humanitarian intervention. 4.1.3, responsibility to protect gives rise to the right of intervention. Then 4.1.4, towards the canonization of the right of humanitarian intervention. Then I had my recommendations, and then I had my policy implications where I had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 points, and then I tied it up with one final paragraph. Now let's look at what the school asked for per conclusion and recommendation so that we grasp things in proper perspective. Recommendation and conclusion. This is the outline that we started using from the first chapter. For recommendations and conclusions the school required. In this section, you should provide your recommendations for your chosen topic and research question addressed. Do you suggest a change in the existing law? Do you suggest a new law? In this section, you should write what you recommend based on the conclusions you have arrived. Then the conclusion, you should show the overall significance of what has been covered. You may want to remind the reader of the most important points that have been made in the report or highlight what you consider to be the most central issues or findings. However, no new material should be introduced in the conclusion. So essentially, your conclusion chapter is where you tie up all loose ends. So you do a short or a brief rundown of what you have talked about, especially what you have come to your own conclusion, your findings in the paper or in the research, and then you chart a way forward from that point. So remember that when you started with an introductory chapter, and then you did literature review where you talked about what other people have said, research that has gone on before you. Then in chapter 3, you covered findings, discussion and analysis, where you talked about what you have come to, what you're proposing, the position that you're assuming regarding that particular matter, the stance that you're taking on that subject area, on that area of law, on that concept that you're talking about. Now, what does chapter 4 do? Chapter 4 gives a brief rundown. So you essentially highlight the most important points that have been raised in your work. And then you say, okay, I've traced the history of this work up to me. I've now added my own to the body of knowledge. Now, how do we move on from here as a society, as a civilization, as a world? Then you give recommendations. And then you add policy implications, because policy implications, especially in a law dissertation, helps policymakers, legislators, and civil societies, as the case may be, to actually implement your research. So under policy implication, what you're doing is, after giving your recommendation, you are now tying your recommendations to real life. So you're saying that this is how it may be applicable in an actual setting, in the real world. This is what I'm saying. This is how it may be applicable. This is how it may be implemented. This is how it may play out. And this is how it should be used or should be done. So that's why policy implication is also important. So policy implication helps people that make laws, people that take chart the course of the civil society forward to, factor your research into their decision making, into their law making, into their policy making, to drive change, impactful, visible change. So now we're going to go over what I eventually did, the final work. So under conclusion, what I was able to do is to say that, okay, this is the position before, this is my own position, this is why my position is a great position as opposed to what was before. So I'm essentially justifying my positions throughout the paper in the sub-edits that I used under the conclusion. That's why I have something like regional consent supersedes sovereign consent. Under that, I said that, let me just read what I have. The adoption of Resolution 1973 authorizing intervention in Libya represented the first time that the UN Security Council had authorized military intervention in a functioning and non-consenting sovereign state for protecting civilians. Let me put my laptop forward so that it will be easier. For protecting civilians. The crucial factor prompting skeptical states to allow the passage of the resolution in the absence of sovereign consent was the fact that relevant regional organizations, OIC, Arab League, AU, UN, Human Rights Council, had consented to and indeed appealed for such action. Essentially, what I'm saying under this heading is that there's sovereign consent, which is against humanitarian intervention. That is, a sovereign state's government does not want humanitarian intervention. They do not want an interference with their sovereignty from external forces, and that is recognized under the principle of sovereignty. But because of the situation, the crisis situation, regional consent then superseded the sovereign consent, in the sense that these regional organizations that I've mentioned, they were appealing at the time for the UN to do something about Libya's case. And they were essentially saying, oh, we cannot watch, we cannot look on. Their vested interests of Libya as a country in our association, in our union. So we're appealing to the UN, which is like a much more general and the bigger umbrella body, to actually do something. So they are essentially consenting on behalf of Libya, because Libya is not in a great position to consent, because Libya, now when I say Libya, I mean the government has turned against its people and cannot see better at that time. So the sovereign, the regional organizations consented on behalf of Libya, to the sovereignty. So so I'm saying that from all that I've discussed in the paper, one of the most important points that I was able to bring about is that even where a state cannot or does not consent to intervention, the societies, the international organizations, regional organizations that the state belongs to can consent on its behalf if it will save the day and prevent or stop mass atrocities and repression of fundamental human rights. So then I said, a lost or compromised sovereignty legitimizes humanitarian intervention. A lost or compromised sovereignty legitimizes humanitarian intervention. So essentially what I've said, and I remember I talked about this in chapter 3, I'm saying that at the time that UN intervened in Libya, some of the features of sovereignty were already lost. There were rival governments and some external forces recognized by Libya, and even some organizations that Libya belonged to, had recognized the rival government, the parallel government set up by, the group that was at loggerheads with the government of Gaddafi on ground, in Libya. So as such, Gaddafi's government no longer had complete or total rule over the state called Libya. So it had lost some features of its sovereignty. It was no longer the only government, so to speak. So, and some other things that I discussed in chapter 3. So that legitimized humanitarian intervention. A parallel force, that's the NTC, that was in Libya at the time, had splitted the internal rule. And for sovereignty to hold, it has to be one rule, one overall, one wholesome, complete, singular government and rulership. But now the NTC had established a parallel rule which was competing with the Gaddafi government's sovereignty. Then 4.1.3, I said responsibility to protect gives rise to the right of humanitarian intervention. Remember that my supervisor had said that I could have discussed responsibility to protect in his initial comments. So I slotted it in the last part, Remember I've said earlier that I didn't want to discuss it because it was going to take me in a different direction already. But now that I'm done talking about everything I want to talk about, it was safe enough for me to just discuss it briefly. Responsibility to protect, which I've written a paper on before now when I was doing the module in international law of conflict and warfare. Responsibility to protect just entails the responsibility given to other nations to look out for an imploding nation, to care for them and to do something about their implosion instead of just looking on. And I talked about, in that paper, I talked about cases where the United Nations did not intervene, where other nations looked away and a nation was imploding in real time. And, the large-scale destruction and repression of human rights, loss of lives and everything, it was massive. And so an intervention was more desirable than a non-intervention. So I've said that, I've discussed that in my finding as well. So you recall that I discussed, what could have happened, what could have been the situation if there was no intervention. So essentially what I'm saying under this is to say that because states have that responsibility, it also lends credence to the appropriateness and the legality of humanitarian intervention in Libya's case. So then I now, those are the most important points that I've argued in my paper or in my dissertation, especially in chapter 3. And then now that I've pointed out those points, towards the end of my conclusion, I now said towards the canonization of the right of humanitarian intervention. So if I've justified humanitarian intervention by saying that, oh, there was a parallel government, sovereignty was lost, there was responsibility to protect, there was regional consent and all of that, then I think humanitarian intervention should be a right on its own, just like any other human right that should arise, because there's a duty already conferred, that's responsibility to protect. So there should be a right of humanitarian intervention on its own, which would, be activated in situations like this. Instead of looking for what should we do, how may we do it, there should be a right, like there's right to life. If you kill someone, you have tampered with their right to life, and there arises a punishment automatically, because it's already enshrined in law. So let us enshrine the right to humanitarian intervention as well, so that when there's an implosion like this, and then we set some parameters that once these are complied with, or we can say that a nation in crisis has ticked all these boxes, then the right to humanitarian intervention, which will reside in the United Nations, can be activated automatically. So that's what I then said in conclusion. And I had a lengthy paragraph on that, and then I moved on to recommendations. So I recommended that an international framework should be developed, which would contain definitive criteria for humanitarian intervention, so that, in Libya's case, post-intervention, there have been so many schools of thoughts rather, or even schools of thoughts, several thoughts, where people have argued for and against the intervention, argued against the mode of intervention, argued against the motive, argued against the outcome, so many things. So now, if there's a definitive criteria, all these things will not take place. People will not think the UN or Western states have ulterior motive for intervening in an imploding state, whether it's in Africa or elsewhere, because there's already a criteria in law. And it will just be a case of following that criteria, ticking out the boxes, and then saying, now let's intervene as the UN. Then I gave a few other recommendations, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Then I went to policy implications. We had an opening paragraph where I talked about, although the intervention was good and it had some great consequences, it also had some untoward consequences that left much to be desired, and as such, here are some key implications that should be considered by international and domestic policymakers. And I talked about the implication of clear and achievable objectives in humanitarian interventions. Before the UN goes in, let there be clear objectives, so that when we are judging that intervention, we will judge it against the objectives that were set before there was an intervention. Then I talked about the importance of international cooperation and consensus in humanitarian intervention. And then I talked about developing the criteria that may be used to appraise conflict situations in sovereign states to decide if the need for an intervention has arisen. I talked about the need to address peculiar crisis situations with tailored solutions. And here I discussed, another novel point by saying that Libya was an heterogeneous state. That is, it had multiple ethnicities, just like Nigeria, for instance. So if the United Nations is intervening in such a state as Libya, it has to consider that, it will be different when intervening in a mono-ethnic society. The solutions must be tailored, because now the NTC was against Gaddafi's government. There were agitations, fueled by ethnic differences. So you have to develop a solution that will cut across ethnicities, not one that will be seen as supporting one ethnic group against the other in situations like that. And then I talked about post-conflict planning and reconstruction efforts. I talked about diplomatic efforts that may, even be put in place to de-escalate crisis situations, even to make sure that an intervention may not even be necessary. And so those are things I talked about as policy implication, and then I tied up the work. So you see that I've been able to build a coherent thesis or dissertation. If anyone reads it from start to finish, it coheres. So you have an idea of what I want to talk about and how I achieved it. I talked about what other people have said. I talked about what I wanted and then how we could move forward from that point. Very important. Like I've said in other videos, always stick to the school's guidelines. So there were things the school asked to see, and I made sure that those things were part of, my paper, because that's how it will be scored. No matter how beautiful your work is, if you are straight out of the school's specifications, you may be on your own. So let's see my supervisor's comment on chapter 4. He said the recommendations and conclusions, that's the marking now, the grading. The recommendations and conclusions chapter is well framed with thoughtful analysis of policy implications. The dissertation is well formatted and referenced. So that's all you have to say about my formatting and referencing as well. Clarity of thought is very important. Also, the use of proper and adequate subheadings, to set out your thoughts. And a chronological or a logical manner is important. It's important to implement feedback from your supervisor. It's important to keep to the word count, because this one was less than 2,000 words. And I was careful about that because, that's what would tie up with the rest of the word count to give the 12,000 words requirement plus or minus 10%. So I had about 13,000 plus. I had my entire thesis was 15,450 words. But when you exclude references, and whatnot, I was within the word count, which was 12,000 words plus or minus 10%. Of course, I used the plus 10%, but I made sure not to exceed it. Very important. Also, the importance of using Chat GPT or Chat AI, Gemini, or whatever it is that may have been developed, when you're writing yours. So you can also use this to write your chapter 4. Not for them to write it for you, but to brainstorm ideas. For instance, like I did with other chapters, you could say like, this is my topic, what should be in my chapter 4? And then it will give you an outline that you can then flesh up and develop. But importantly, if you're using a writing aid such as Chat AI or GPT or Chat GPT or Gemini, make sure that whatever they are giving you, you don't paste it verbatim in your work. Very important, like I've said, your supervisor is also probably and most likely tech enabled. So what if they have also used it, to check what you will be submitting? Or what if someone else is writing something anywhere in the world and they regurgitate what, the machine has given to you? So it's important to be original in your thoughts. Just use these things as aid to aid you. So even if it writes you a paragraph, make sure you rewrite it yourself. Let there be an infusion of your own novel thinking in your dissertation. And then do the referencing properly. Every other thing, beautify the work. Let it be nice and tidy and easy to read, because that's very important. It's important for whoever is reading your work, and the first audience and reader is your supervisor. Let them be happy that they are reading. Let them be able to follow your flow of thought, logically and easily, so that they will award you a great mark from the goodness of their hearts. So that's all I have for you in this video. I'll see you in my next video. We'll tie up this series now, but if I have questions and comments, I may make another video. If I think of something else that I wanted to, or I need to add or speak about for my LLM thesis, I may add it. But this is all I have for now on writing your LLM dissertation. I will see you in my very next video. Don't forget to subscribe. Toodles.